Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy. I'm the Director of Professional Development for the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools. And we are so glad you're here today for this really important conversation on diversity, equity, inclusion in Episcopal schools. We have a fantastic group of panelists today. We have Dan Heischman, David Madison, and Sandy Hannibal here from NAES, as well as our esteemed Interim Executive Director, Andrew Wooden. Welcome, panelists. We're glad you're here. So a few housekeeping items before we begin. I just want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and everyone registered will receive a link to watch the recording of this event. So it usually takes a little time for Zoom to get that to us, but as soon as we get it, we'll push that out to you. You're going to receive some copies of any resources that are offered, so stay tuned for that as well. We really want this to be an interactive webinar today. So you've got a couple of ways in which you can interact. Of course, you've always got the chat feature, and we'd love for you to chat in that chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen if you're on a regular computer. And we're going to be offering opportunity for Q&A, but we'd like for those questions to be put into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. So if you don't mind just putting your name and your school in the chat feature, just to be sure that that's working. You can also test out your Q&A box to make sure that that's working. And we'll just get started in just a second. Again, this is an hour webinar. We will offer about, 15, 20 minutes, if we can, of opportunities for Q&A. And if you have a specific question for a specific panelist, feel free to put that in there. If not, I'm gonna send it where I need to send it. And then if it's not the person I should have sent it to, then we'll figure that out. So anyway, let's go ahead. I think that's the time. That's enough of housekeeping for now. And I would love to just turn it over to Reverend Dan Heischman, our Executive Director of NAES, to get us started. Dan?
Thank you, Mary Catherine, and thanks specifically to Mary Catherine for setting this up. And judging from the number of registrations we have today, this is meeting a big need, and hopefully we will help to respond to that need. Also, I want to thank Andrew Wooden for his work as Interim Director of SAES this year, and for keeping that wonderful organization alive following David Madison's departure to NAES, which we're delighted to have him with us, but to thank Andrew for his wonderful work this year. And also with us is Sandy Hannibal, who works with NAES as a consultant for our Episcopal Identity and Diversity project. And you'll hear from Sandy in a second. Perhaps one of the most important things that we at NAES have done this past year is develop a statement on inclusion and Episcopal identity. And this came out of what we were hearing from a number of schools, a number of individuals, which we also heard through the equity audit that we as an association undertook last year. And that was whether it's from diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice coordinators, heads of schools, chaplains, the need for a restatement, as well as a clear statement about how the work that schools do in DEIJ does in fact dovetail and in fact is grounded in Episcopal identity. And so we felt, and our board affirmed that it was very important that we do that at this particular time, not only to help support schools in their diversity initiatives, but also to hold out there a challenge to all of our schools, to respond to the needs of the time, but also to do it in such a way that we're not simply adding on something new. We are in fact going back to our roots, who we are as Episcopal schools, which is grounded in the baptismal covenant, where it says respect for the dignity of every human being. And so we hopefully emphasized in that statement that we're really saying nothing new here. We're just saying what's basic to the Christian faith and what is basic to being an Episcopal school. And one of the people that really helped us along in this was Sandy Hannibal. And so I want to ask Sandy, if you'd say a little bit about why you feel such a statement was important for NAES to issue.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everybody. It's so nice to see that there's so many people here joining us today. In answer to your question, I've been hearing for some time that schools were not clear on what Episcopal identity actually meant. And people had been asking for some clarity. They particularly were not sure about the intersection of DEIJ work and Episcopal identity. And then in the spring of 2021, lots of schools were starting to get pushback for the initiatives that they had put in place with regard to DEIJ work. There were parents and other constituents who were using their interpretation of Christian values and Episcopal identity to say that the schools should not be doing DEIJ work, that it went against all of those values. And people were starting to get frustrated. Heads of school, faculty members, parents who didn't agree with that kind of pushback. And there was a request for more support from NAES, a request for a concise and clear statement that people could perhaps put on their website, hand out as part of their admissions packet, give to new hires, something that they could hand to people when they pushed back to say, we are an Episcopal school, and this is what NAES says about what an Episcopal school is. And they were also asking for definitions for DEIJ terms. And all of that is included in this statement. And I can't tell you how grateful people have been. And they have indeed put it on their websites and used it in admissions and use this statement in a variety of ways. They are so grateful for the support that they feel that they have as a result of this statement. And I think David is going to tell you a little bit more about this statement.
Thanks, Sandy. So as Dan mentioned, this is on our website. We'll make sure there's a link available to the full statement that was passed by or released by our governing board back in September. And rather than, having us go through and read the document, there's 6 things I'd like to highlight about the document. And then I would commend you to take a look at the full text on your own. But a couple of things I'd like to highlight that I think are important for our conversation today. First, this is an opportunity. This has been a rough several months, a rough couple of years. And I know a lot of our schools have had lots of difficult conversations around this topic. And we start by framing this as an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to reassert that our identity and our mission as Episcopal schools call us to be more inclusive. And the reason for that is, and the reason that commitment, or what that commitment is grounded in, is the core belief, as Dan mentioned, in the baptismal covenant. And there's 3 phrases from the baptismal covenant that I think are important to highlight: to seek and serve Christ in all persons, to strive for justice and peace among all people, and to respect the dignity of every human being. So we have that core belief that we use to frame the conversations around this topic. And again, this is an opportunity for us to recognize that core belief is what drives us in these kinds of conversations. There's something else that's important, and that's the intellectual tradition of Episcopal schools. Throughout our history, Episcopal schools have been places where we question, we probe, we dig deeper, into those ideas and into those beliefs that ground us. And because that's such an important part of our tradition, it should inform our work in this area as well. We shouldn't be afraid of difficult conversations. We shouldn't shy away from difficult conversations. Rather, we should lean into those, and we should dig deeper into this core belief and into this opportunity. Our, what I call Episcopal nature, is how we do this work, how we have these conversations. There's a unique way that Episcopal communities have these types of conversations. It's marked by graciousness, by generosity, and probably most importantly, by humility. We go into these conversations, and frankly, all difficult conversations, with the understanding that we don't have all of the answers, and that's okay. Rather, we bring different perspectives together in community, and we work through these conversations together. That's how we as Episcopal communities have always faced difficult conversations. And it's no different now when we're talking about inclusion in our Episcopal schools. The diversity of our communities require that we do this work. We create ecumenical groups, or we create ecumenical communities where people from all different backgrounds come together. And that, in my opinion, makes this work even more important because we are creating diverse communities. We are attracted by families, by faculty members who want to be part of diverse communities, which just frankly makes it even more important that we have these conversations. And finally, as Sandy mentioned, it's very common for these conversations to run into problems with regard to definitions. It's very common for us to not have a common understanding of what are these different words that we're using, and what does that word mean? What does that word mean? Lots of schools have struggled by not having a common lexicon, a common understanding about what the words in this area mean. And so in addition to the statement, you'll see below some definitions. And the hope there is that we'll all be able to have clearer conversations and make sure we're all using the right words to express what we're trying to express. I wanted to read one bit from the document because I do think this is important. I view this as the charge, really. The governing board of NAES is calling on our school boards to spend time discussing the nature and mission of Episcopal schools. We're also calling on our admissions professionals to be intentional in sharing with families our Episcopal mission and how it might differ from other Christian perspectives. And we're calling for our schools to work with parents in helping them understand what Episcopal schools do and why. The hope is that this statement will provide a context for that, provide a way for you to have that conversation, provide a way for you to have that conversation that's consistent with our Episcopal identity, consistent with our dedication to the intellectual tradition that has made our schools great, and also with some common words, some common definition, so that the conversation can be as fruitful as possible. We'll put a link to the full document in the chat. I would commend you to take a look at that full document when you have a moment. I think it's going to be an excellent resource, as Sandy has mentioned. Lots of schools are using that. I've recently worked with a couple of different schools that are using this document as a way to frame the conversation, just as the charge identified that I read to you a few moments ago. So again, we can dig into some specifics in the Q&A, but hopefully that gives you a summary of what that document contains. I'm going to hand it back over to MK now, and let's have a little time for some questions and answers.
Okay, so we don't have any questions yet, but I would love for one of you to maybe address, while we're waiting on additional questions, and folks, you can ask questions about anything here. You can ask questions about the statement or anything Sandy had to say. But I would just be curious, one of the things we've talked a lot about, at least within SAES, and I'm sure this is true across the nation, is the different types of schools across the spectrum of, like, within our 5-state region, we have so many. We have preschools and we have high schools and we have parish day schools and independent schools. I'm just curious what you guys are seeing in terms of how this issue is being, is it a challenge because all the different schools are so different that it's hard to go in and kind of have one conversation around, this is how you should do DEI in your school, right? Because everyone is so different. I wonder if you could maybe speak to that, either David or Sandy, about the differences in our schools and how they're approaching this conversation.
Sandy, why don't you take that? One of the things that Sandy does is facilitate our different affinity groups. And one of the affinity groups that we have are the DEIJ practitioners. And so I'm going to defer to Sandy because I think she could probably share some of the different challenges they're facing. I think they are different, probably based partially on geography, probably based partially on tradition. But Sandy, what are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right, David. It really does depend on where you are geographically. It depends on your school's traditions. It depends on depends on your school community, because you can be in the South and still, or in the Southwest, or someplace you would assume would be conservative. But if your school's tradition has been to really work seriously on DEIJ work, then the process is much easier for you. These schools have moved along, and there are schools all over the country that have met some real challenges because their traditions have been exclusive. So it depends on where you are. It depends on your community. It depends on your leadership. And it depends on the kind of commitment your school is able to make to doing this work. But it's different all over the country.
Yeah. Do you see it especially difficult in preschools? I mean, do you find that that's because of the age of the kid, and do you find that a preschool to be more difficult to start the conversation?
To be very honest, most of the people that I have talked with have been in K-12 schools. K-8, K-12. I've done very little work with people from preschools, but
right.
my personal background is working with preschools and as a preschool teacher and a kindergarten teacher, and that's a place to start, and it's actually the easiest and the least challenging place to start, because you start with very simple things like difference and laying the groundwork for understanding that the difference is normal, and helping little kids understand that and talk about what that means, talk about how your family is different from my family, but this is something wonderful that your family does, and this is something wonderful my family does, and you look different from me, but we still like to play soccer, and those sorts of things. And there's lots of literature out there these days. So personally, it seems to me that preschool is really the place to start, and you can start there without too much difficulty, because you're not bringing up difficult subjects.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Sandy, because this last February, we did an early learning series, and one of the topics, one of the hour-and-a-half sessions, was this idea of diversity, teaching diversity to preschoolers. And it began, interestingly, where one of the things that they really talked a lot about was the idea of literature and toys and all of that, how you're setting up your classroom for inclusion. And that was incredible to me. I just thought that was what a simple thing, and yet never occurred to me. So I love that. David, what are your thoughts on that?
I want to pick up if this is okay, Mary Kath, I want to pick up one of the questions in the chat.
Okay.
And I want to ask Dan to comment on this. So one of the questions in the chat is all this conversation with Episcopal about diversity and inclusion, but how many of our schools have minorities in leadership positions? And I wanted to give Dan an opportunity to comment on some of the initiatives that NAES is in the process of taking to address that very good question.
Well, thanks for asking. First of all, the number of leaders of color in our schools is alarmingly low. It is behind the overall representation of students of color in our schools. That's the given, that's the reality. We began a couple of years ago a program where we, with the help of Louise Otley at St. Martin's in Atlanta and Kadisha Fredericks at St. Andrews in Saratoga, California, a program of interviewing heads of color in Episcopal schools to learn about their experience, to understand what were some of the particular challenges of assuming and moving into leadership roles, what it was like in the search process. And we came up with some really important information from that. And one of the things that has been translated into is we are now beginning to have affinity groups for our heads of color, as well as aspiring heads of color. But I think it's fair to say, in the grand scheme of things in Episcopal schools around the country, that those number of people in leadership positions is low. And as I said, lags behind overall representation of students of color in our schools.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Okay, I do have a question. What methods, I'm going to say this is maybe for Sandy. What methods have you found effective for getting constituencies, AKA board members, parents, faculty, and students, to lean into the discomfort of even examining themselves and their own awareness of ways and historical reasons the school has failed to include and support diverse faculty, administration, students?
Well, first, I think you have to look at your community and really understand your community, and give your community, give the people in your community an opportunity to tell their stories and get to know each other. And it also helps sometimes to have someone come in and have the conversation, start the conversation about what inclusion actually means and what it might mean for your school and your traditions. But it really depends on your community and the traditions that are important to your school. I hope that is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a challenging that's a really challenging question in general, because, again, we're all so different in the way we do what we do. I think, I wonder, David, do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to add?
It's tough. I do want to echo, I think it's sometimes helpful to have a trusted person from the outside come in. I think that sometimes is a way to set up the conversation, to tee up the conversation without unintentionally bumping someone out. And what I mean by that is it's very difficult to participate in a conversation and facilitate a conversation.
Right.
And so most of the time, the folks that really need to be involved in the conversation are sometimes also tapped to facilitate it. And that can be a challenge. So I think it does make sense to have a trusted person come in and help frame those conversations. And then just recognizing that your different stakeholders, that question listed all the different stakeholders, recognize that those stakeholders are all probably in very different places on this topic, and trying to identify what are the commonalities that can bring us together. And again, it really goes back to that mission of Episcopal schools, and recognizing that we're involved in this work, not just because we think it's a great idea, but because we're called to do this work as a result of our understanding of the baptismal covenant. So that's a great place to start, but recognizing that again, that's not going to solve everything. Everyone's not going to say, oh, okay, great, we're all on board. We have to kind of talk about that and lean into our intellectual tradition of different perspectives and working through those different perspectives with graciousness and with humility and all those things. It's such a complicated conversation. So I do think it makes sense to have an outside expert, someone who's a facilitator who really can help tee those conversations up. I think that's a good strategy.
I'm wondering, Sandy, where that begins. Does that, if you brought somebody in, where does it begin with the faculty? Do you see it beginning with the board? Where would you recommend that conversation start?
I think it depends on your school.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to remind people that this is not a job that one person does. It's really important that the head of school and that the administration is there to support the group of people who are planning whatever that first step is. So I think one of your first steps is to make sure that you have a group of people who are going to work together and support you. So when things go sideways, you have the backing of the head of school, and you have a group that's going to figure out, well, what's the next step. But it really, every school is different,
Right.
but
So
it is very important to have the board and the administration backing the DEIJ work. You can't do it without their backing.
Andrew, I'd love, I don't know if you want to jump in on this. You know, we had a good conversation around this topic last week, and I'd just love your thoughts on, we talked a little bit about where to begin with that group. Do you have thoughts on that?
I do, because mission, vision, and values come from the board and are upheld by the board. A committee on DEI or DEIJ that truly supports the work and does so visibly, gives the head the support that the head needs to then work with all the other constituencies. I think perhaps the challenging work is to find safe conversations with boards of trustees where each individual trustee feels safe to share their own opinions, because we can't assume that all boards are of one mind on this topic. So I've found success at a number of our schools, Mary Catherine, of working individually with trustees and finding a common understanding, if not a common agreement. So I search for understanding first, and agreement can come later. But I love David and I were at a workshop in Chicago when we were reminded by the consultant that the mission, vision, and values are board work, and all of what NAES is talking about is mission, vision, and values, and that's universal, and boards should be able to buy in.
Yeah.
David, did I speak?
No, I appreciate that comment. I was going to throw, I'm watching there's some really good conversation in the Q&A strand. I do want to highlight one of the comments and get Sandy to respond. One of the comments is that DEI work nationwide is still white owned. What makes the way Episcopalians see this issue different? Because once you locate the difference, then there lies the sweet spot for change. What's your response to that comment, Sandy?
I'm not sure, to be very honest.
Sure.
I think it's predominantly white people who have to do the work. If that is what that comment referred to, and I think very often people decide, well, if we have a person of color come in and talk with us, they'll tell us what to do and we don't have to do the work. In terms of Episcopal identity, it's part of that commitment to intellectual curiosity and having the conversation and being willing to have a conversation in a respectful way. I'm not quite sure what the person meant by that question, but I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Hey, we have a question here. What is your advice for dealing with very vocal members in the community who have stated that they do not support DEIJ work and do not want the school to even begin the effort to address this work? Sandy, I'm sure you've run across this.
I say look at the mission statement. And not only look at the mission statement, but now look at the statement from NAES. And in that way, a school can say that this is our grounding, and this is who we are, and this is the work we're charged to do.
Yeah. Okay, another question. How do you address the comment when staff are talking about DEIJ work? We just want to love like Jesus does. I treat all children the same. That's another kind of it kind of relates to the last question.
We're not the same. That is a very good way to get out of the work. We're not the same. We're not treated the same. We are different, and we need to honor those differences, lift them up, be joyful about them, understand what they mean, appreciate them, love each other. It goes back to the baptismal covenant. And Jesus didn't say just love everybody who looks like you. Love everybody. And so that's my response.
Yeah, that does kind of fall into the whole challenge with the we're colorblind approach.
Right.
Which, you have to kind of unpack that and try to understand what's being said by that. But as Sandy said, there are differences that we should talk about and that frankly we should celebrate.
Right.
And so the concern about, we love everyone, we're colorblind. Are you truly loving all of everyone? Does that make sense? I mean, are you truly loving everything, all elements of the person if you're quote colorblind unquote? And I think some people would say that that's a challenge. That's a problem if you're not recognizing that there are certain things that are inherent about the student's experience, certain things that are inherent about the student's character, that the concern would be a quote colorblind unquote approach avoids having a conversation around that. Does that, Sandy, your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think it's important for people to understand if you start from the place of, I love everybody who is exactly like me. And I don't really understand people who are not like me. They're kind of scary. So I'm going to push them aside there. They are other. So it's important to understand that we are different. And when we look at people very narrowly and don't see the whole person, don't see who they are, don't see what their background is, we're not talking about loving that person. We're talking about loving the part of that person that's like us.
Yeah, well said. David, I'd like to go back to, if we could, I'm just curious about you kind of talked a little bit in the statement about the definitions and how that seems to be a stumbling block to some extent in the work, because people don't have a commonality in those definitions. They don't really understand. What talk a little bit about that, because I think that's kind of to the point, what we were just talking about this idea of I'm colorblind. I think it's an easy way to get out of doing the work when you just think that you know the definition of something. Does that make sense? And so talk a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things that I really like about our statement is you'll see with the definitions, you'll see biblical references and you'll see biblical content that helps inform our understanding of these different terms. So in my work with some schools, there's just not agreement around words like inclusion, equity, justice, belonging, and they're just kind of all over the map. And certain words indicate certain ideas for some people and a very different idea for others. I know in the practitioner conversations, this comes up a lot. And so there's just a need for us to have a common lexicon for us to assess where are we in connection with some of these concepts and where do we want to go in connection with some of these concepts. So my experience has been that without that common understanding, it's very difficult to have a conversation. That's been my experience. So that's why I think it's really important for us to talk about this Episcopal identity connection with inclusion, but also to make sure we're working on the same words, make sure we're using the same lexicon.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I appreciate the most about the statement is that it gives us some commonality. It gives us the ability to look at the statement and have everybody be able to look at it together. So yeah, I think that's helpful. Okay, we do have a question in the chat, and many of us experience economic disparities which feed into our experience of this work. What successes are schools having which recruit people, faculty and students of color when there are often extreme economic barriers to such? I think that's a great question. Not sure who wants to jump in there and answer it. What are y'all seeing?
I'm going to jump in just with a question. I'm wondering if when we talk about economic disparity and students of color, are we assuming that all students of color are in need of financial aid? And do we dismiss the fact that there are white students who also need some financial assistance? I think we often just assume that any child of color that is coming into a school is going to need assistance. So that's something to keep in mind.
Right. We have another comment here. The world is not and never has been colorblind. If we are going to nurture the whole child, we have to nurture the child in light of how the world sees that child. Back to kind of the original thought around preschools, Sandy, I think it seems like such a simple thing, but the idea that you create a classroom in which a person of color can see themselves, I think that's just such a simple thing, but to go in and to see a classroom where there's literature that isn't just white, and there are toys and dolls that reflect the diversity of a classroom. What kind of speak to that idea of that simplicity of something like that?
I think you're laying the groundwork, as I said before, for the fact that difference is normal.
Right.
And having a classroom that reflects the world, that reflects people of all colors, that represents people of all abilities, and having a curriculum that represents everyone. For example, you might have a unit on families, and you talk about the different kinds of families. It's not just a nuclear family. And families come in all different shapes and sizes and combinations. keeping it simple, keeping it within the realm of a child's world, helping children understand that children everywhere need love, food, and shelter. And people just do it in different ways.
David,
I just want to follow up to the question we had earlier about schools that are having successes with regard to access. And just, I did want to throw out a comment about some of our urban alliance schools. That's a different model from some of our other schools. Many of those are tuition-free schools. And so if you look at some of those schools, you'll see different business models. You'll see different approaches to access that I think are being very successful. I think they're coming up with some really great strategies to help close that gap when it's so difficult to access lots of our schools. And as Sandy mentioned, you'll see a wide variety of types of kids at those schools. It's not just one particular racial makeup.
all right. So here's a question. How do you measure the success of this program? I'm assuming the question is, how do you measure the success of whether you're doing well in the conversation? I guess that's the question. How do you know if it's working? David?
I think it's important, and again, everyone on the panel, please jump in, correct me. I think it's important to start with a very accurate assessment of where things are now. I think that's really important to use an instrument, to use some type of approach to collect a fair and accurate assessment of how your community is doing right now in living up to the Episcopal mission of creating inclusive communities. To me, I think it's really important to start with that. And then I think once you have some really good data around those questions, access, faculty demographics, board demographics, all of those things, then I think it's easier to measure success after you do a snapshot, where are we, and then identify some goals for where we want to be in a reasonable amount of time. I'll throw it open to the rest of the panel because they may have some other comments about measuring the success of this type of work.
Additional thoughts on that topic?
David's right to start where he has, and that's often around the diversity piece of it, which is visible to some degree. I've seen a number of schools be very successful in engaging student panels, faculty and staff panels to talk about how they think they're doing. That doesn't sound like a very specific metric, but through panels and through conversations in affinity groups and in diversity work, and diversity practitioners can be very helpful in speaking to where they think a community is doing at a particular place. And those ongoing conversations can give an administration and a board a sense of whether the arc is bending in the right direction and how fast.
That's good. That's good stuff. Okay, so we have a question. Does NAES or SAES have resources available for how we might change the content of our curriculum to create more inclusive learning environments and to teach subjects that are not in more traditional white dominated curriculum or pedagogies? So that's a good question, because that's if we're looking to change something real tactical like that, do y'all have thoughts on that, Sandy, about how you might go about that?
That's always a challenge. And I will be very honest with you, or right off the top of my head, I can't help you with specific curricula.
Okay.
I wish I could.
Right.
Was there
think that's
someone
gonna
else that has a
require-
better
yeah.
answer? Sorry
Well,
about that.
I would just plug the diversity conference that's coming up in March.
Yeah.
That's going to be without a doubt one of the conversations that will be explored probably on Thursday, but probably on Friday as well, when we're really kind of rolling up our sleeves and trying to dig into the where do we go next at our
Right.
particular school. That's really the Friday of that conference is focusing on that. And the hope is that we'll be able to have some conversations around that. And we may be able to identify some really great resources that schools can call upon. I know schools are doing great work in this area, and we're kind of in the process now of collecting what it is they're doing.
Yes, I'd add the obvious of the usefulness of listservs. A quick query on who is leading in curriculum will lead you to the right places, and the best professional development is often colleague to colleague, school to school.
For sure.
I would also plug our discussion boards. The NAES community is another wonderful place where you can pose these types of questions, and we can really hear from leaders from all of our schools that can maybe share some specific curricula pieces in different subject areas. So I would commend the community to you as well.
Yeah, Jonathan has put in information in the chat on that conference. So I would encourage you to check that out. We've got another question, and this is a really interesting one for those with parish schools. I believe our school community would be best served by partnering with our Episcopal Church community in addressing DEIJ. Can anyone suggest practical ways that schools and churches can work together on these challenges? I think that's a great question.
I'll take it if
Okay.
that's okay. So
Yeah.
so yes, I've done some work recently with a board and a vestry together around this work, Episcopal identity, and this particular work. That's a great place to start. So, from a very nuts and bolts perspective, if you have an annual retreat, a board vestry retreat, if you're a parish day school, that's a great venue to explore how can we identify some of the commonalities about our Episcopal identity that can inform this work. If you're not having those kinds of conversations, it may make sense to explore how can we have that conversation. But bringing the vestry together, bringing the board together, I think is a great way to partner and start exploring that shared Episcopal identity. And what does that shared Episcopal identity say specifically in connection with this work? Lots of parishes and schools are developing some great synergy around that and are even deepening their relationship, because this is such an important conversation to have that really is guided by our shared Episcopal identity. So those would be my thoughts on that.
Yeah, it kind of goes without saying, but it feels like it would be important to just say that begins with the head of school. In a parish school, that's going to begin with the head of school and the rector, and that relationship of deciding as a partnership, we're gonna address this together. So,
I mean, my approach with all of this work is, the more the merrier. I mean, the more friends you have, the better. The more folks, the more stakeholders you can join in these conversations, the better. Now, obviously, that means we're not going to all agree. That's okay. But this is something that should, if you're a parish day school, this should involve conversations between the church leadership and the school leadership.
yes. So we do have a question. This is a tactical question. And it may be for Sandy. What do you think about the Pollyanna curriculum? Our school is looking at it seriously. Is anyone familiar with the Pollyanna curriculum?
I've heard very good things about the Pollyanna curriculum. Definitely worth looking at. Keeping in mind that you have to think about your particular school and is it going to work for your school? But I have heard very, very good things about it.
Great. We did have a question in the chat about your conference in March is still proceeding as an in-person event, correct, David?
Yes, it's an in-person event.
Is that an event y'all want to, is there still room to register, or what's the situation with that?
You know, I believe there's still room as of today. We're about to go to a wait list. Dan is in the office in New York, so has closer access to Jonathan than I do. But I believe there is still room as of today.
We're going to have to cap the conference simply because of the social distancing expectations at the place of the conference. So I would certainly encourage people that if you want to register, to do so soon, because we're not far away from capping that conference in terms of numbers.
Great. Okay, so top of the hour is getting close. So I'd just like to, I'd like to turn it over. Are there any final thoughts from the panelists before I turn it over to Andrew?
I want to mention a couple things. One is the importance of board work on this, as Andrew was saying, because one of the things we've seen as a very common pattern is that initially there is board support for the head's leadership on DEIJ initiatives. And then the parental feedback and pushback begins, and boards then soften in their support of that. And so there's really got to be work done at the board level to help board members understand why this is important. And the second thing, I think it's a challenge to all of us, and that is that after the murder of George Floyd, we had a whole plethora of schools make powerful and important statements about what they were going to be doing and what their response was. I think it's a good time right now to drag out those statements and say, and realize, how have we done? Have we followed through with these things? Has anything changed? And admittedly, there's a lot of stuff related to the pandemic that has kept us busy. But I think it's worth us going back to those statements that our schools made. Again, wonderful statements. And asking, how are we doing?
That's great. I appreciate that, Dan. Andrew, you want to close us out, please?
Yes, happily. But before I do, I want to say that no truer words have been spoken than those that Dan just spoke. And if you look at the ICASA statement, ICASA being the organization that accredits all the school accreditation agencies, they have come out with a very simple 3-sentence statement that I think reflects what Dan is talking about. It's not only about diversity and inclusion, it has the justice piece in it too, and it has the anti-racist piece in it too, and I highly recommend it. But I'll get off my soapbox and close by simply thanking David, Dan, and Sandy for providing such a compelling argument for the way that Episcopal identity is inextricably linked to the work of DEIJ. We applaud NAES's new work called At the Heart of Our Identity, and specifically developing the NAES statement on inclusion and Episcopal identity. The conversation on this call will undoubtedly lead to even more work around the country. The thinking that was shared in this webinar, as well as the resources available on the NAES website, are serving Episcopal schools well. As I visit our SAES schools in our 6-state region, it's clear that our heads, many of whom are on this call today, are deeply engaged in these conversations. And we're looking nationally for more thoughtful voices on this topic as we discern the right path for our own specific communities. Last Thursday and Friday, Mary Catherine and I led professional development sessions in the SAES New Heads University, and DEIJ was one of the more engaging topics in San Antonio. During our presentation, we referenced this important work from NAES. We also noted that we're truly grateful to be leading Episcopal schools at this time in our country's history. And today we're especially grateful to NAES and especially Dan and David. So allow me to bring this call to a close and say thank you all for participating today. And I'm wishing you the very best and Godspeed.
Thanks, everyone. Andrew, great words. And I cannot reiterate that enough. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Thank you to NAES for being a part of this. I'm going to go ahead. For those of you who are live with us, I'm going to stop the recording. I do have one more question for the panel. After that, if you are watching this as a recording, we thank you for being a part of it and hope that you will continue the work.